Well, greetings, everyone. My name's Jeff Wagner, and welcome to our December Azure Apps and Infrastructure Community Call. I'm the community lead for this particular area of our section of readiness. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We've got Ali and Dale on the line. Ali, Dale, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Sure. This is Ali Hussain. I'm a cloud solutions architect on the One Commercial Partner team, covering applications and infrastructure on Azure, and looking forward to the session here.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Hey, I'm Dale Kirby. I'm also a cloud solution architect. I'm on the same team as Ali, covering applications and infrastructure. Definitely looking forward to discussing serverless today.
Well, great. Thanks for being here. And you know, as we like to do with this particular community call, we like to make it open. And what I mean by that is, you know, we're going to have one slide. I'll pop that up in just a second. It's just going to be in the background. And this is more, you know, it's designed to be an open discussion about a particular topic, and here it's serverless. So I'm going to start things out. Serverless. That makes no sense to me. I'm an infrastructure guy. What do you mean serverless? Explain that to me. Give me the basic 101 of serverless. So somebody like me who just has been born and raised building and taking care of and seeing the health and well-being of servers for a very long time, now it's serverless. I don't get it. What does it mean?
Yeah, hey, this is Dale. I'll take that one, Jeff. So that's a great question. I'm kind of the same way, you know, coming from a 20-year IT career. Servers are pretty important. You hear serverless, you start to think, well, what does that really mean? And to me, a good analogy is kind of like you can think of serverless like we think of wireless when we use the term wireless. You know, when you go to the coffee shop, when you're connecting to your home Wi-Fi, you're not really thinking about any wires that are, you know, in your network closet or, connected to your router, but they're still there. And in a lot of ways, serverless is fairly similar. So when we talk about building applications on serverless tech, there's certainly still servers somewhere, but the difference from a developer standpoint is that we don't have to really think about the servers anymore. Instead, we can think about building code and essentially writing methods or functions that are running on some server infrastructure that lives somewhere, but we don't really care about that. The management of those servers is completely obfuscated from us as a developer. And so when we use things like Azure Functions, which is a Microsoft's primary serverless technology platform, we're just writing code, we're writing functions, we're executing those functions on top of the serverless, quote-unquote serverless infrastructure, but we don't have to worry about managing those servers, patching those servers, scaling those servers as our app increases in scale. All of that's completely managed from the Microsoft side. So that's the way that I like to think about serverless. Certainly the servers are there. They're still very important, but they're not the forefront. They're not what we're primarily concerned about when we're developing with that mentality, with the serverless mindset.
Okay, I can breathe a little bit better. So there are servers still there. Okay. You mentioned something called Azure Functions. What are those and what do they do?
Yeah, good question. Azure Functions is Microsoft's serverless offering. It's an Azure platform service, and so what we can do with Azure Functions is essentially write methods, write microservices, write application services that run C# code, that run Node.js, that run Java, all very familiar to us as developers. We're writing code the same way we do when we're thinking about the world of traditional development. We're using Visual Studio. We're writing out our code. We're testing our code, all that good stuff. But we're actually able to deploy those functions, those methods, to the Azure Functions platform instead of deploying our code to servers and to to the underlying infrastructure that we're used to. We can just put that out on Azure Functions. Azure Functions will automatically handle all the scale that we might need. It'll handle everything from an infrastructure management standpoint for us, and all we really have to do is write our code and connect our, if we're building an application with the microservices, framework. We can just connect those different microservices together, and all that management of those code is all handled in the Azure Functions platform, all behind the scenes.
Interesting. So does infrastructure as a service go away?
No, definitely not. You can kind of think of Azure Functions as a kind of platform as a service. It's not quite the same as some of the other platform as a service offerings, but it's similar. It's a platform as a service offering. But that doesn't mean that infrastructure as a service is dead and buried or anything like that. Certainly, there's going to be different use cases depending on the customer scenario or the solution requirements that are going to necessitate traditional either on-prem or IaaS infrastructure to run things like legacy code, to integrate with other back-end systems that might not really be suited for a serverless framework. So no, definitely not the end of the world for IaaS or even on-prem in this case.
Okay. So here's a broader question. What would be a difference between serverless and containers? Or are they just the same thing with two different names?
That sounds like an Ali question. Ali, you want to take that one?
I know he does.
Yeah, I heard containers, and I know Ali's ears are perking up. Ali, you're on mute.
Sorry, I had to cut my video because my laptop couldn't handle. Can you ask?
Yeah, so Ali, we heard about serverless. So what's the difference between serverless and containers?
Yes, absolutely. Serverless is a platform as a service, i.e., you are giving your code as a developer to the platform and having the platform account for scaling, monitoring, and the execution of your code. Whereas in a container, you're not only just giving a code, you're configuring your code, you're deploying the binaries that your code depends on. So it's an abstraction. You're treating a container. Think of a container more of an abstraction above a server, whereas in serverless functions is the execution of a set of logic that you have developed.
Gotcha. Okay. So give me an example of where I would use serverless. If I hear something, what's the association? I hear this, I should think serverless. I hear that, I should think serverless. What does that look like?
Okay, so when you hear, let's make the case for. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, my Skype window is blinking, but I'll continue since you guys can hear me. From a serverless perspective, think of it as the back end implementation of an application, i.e., you have a front end web server and such, which within the front end web server, there's a bunch of different operations that are happening based on the input of a user, for example. What you could utilize serverless for, a good use case for serverless is that each of those operations that get initiated from the front end can be implemented on a serverless technology. So your front end is still supplemented by logic that is running on a server, but you can break down your calls and have the calls be implemented on a serverless technology. And that goes the same thing. It doesn't need the initiation of a call does not need to be from a web server. If I were to think about it from an operations perspective, let's say that every time a new VM comes up, you want to know about it, or your operations team wants to know about it. You can through serverless you can create logic and deploy it on serverless functions technology, where let's say the logic will send an email to your operations team every time a VM goes down, or a VM has high CPU or memories running low. Any of those kind of operational tasks can be handled by having a logic implemented on serverless as opposed to running it within a VM, and then you also have to account for the VM going down potentially as well.
Okay. There's a couple of questions in the IM window. Rick, I don't know if you have a chance to come off mute and ask your question. I'll give you a moment if you do. If not, I'm happy to read what you dropped into the IM window.
Yeah, so I'm a database guy, so that's why I put this in this context. There's an Azure SQL database, right? We have DTUs. Azure SQL DW, we have DWUs, and just IaaS, we have choices around how much cores, RAMs, I/O, stuff like that. So is there a way, whenever we're using serverless technology, we can specify a priority or strength or some way of saying, I want this to finish really fast?
So the initiation time of a serverless container, if you think about it from the question, yes, there is. But the limitation is you can have it run on a dedicated host. There are app service backed functions as well. And on that, you can specify the SKUs. But in general, you shouldn't have functions as such. Functions, the limitation is on you're paying for basically the runtime of your code that you've deployed in a function. And that's how, and you don't want to run a monolithic application on functions. What you want to do is you want to implement microservices approach and segregate your code in such a way that is broken down into different function calls. And some front end is aggregating those calls. You don't want your front end to be deployed on functions. Because there's a limitation on the amount of runtime a function technology can do. The other platforms have that limitation, and so does Azure. So that's one limitation. The other is memory consumption. It can only run memory, as in how large can your code base be? You can't put a gigabytes worth of code and expect Microsoft Functions to execute your 1,000 lines of code every time a call comes in. There's a limitation on how much code you can upload.
Yeah, Ali, that's some great points. One of the things that it took me a little bit to wrap my head around this is with the world of serverless, with Azure Functions, and with Lambda and other offerings. The concept of micro billing becomes more and more critical to your cost estimates, your forecasting, and things like that. Because if you go to the Azure Functions page, you'll see you're literally charged per execution of your function, and it's a very small charge, but obviously you need to think about those kinds of be thinking about your capacity planning a little bit differently, in your cost estimating a little bit differently with the serverless mindset, and thinking more in terms of how are my microservices that make up the back end of my app really going to execute against Azure Functions, and how is that going to then translate into what is the cost for me to run this application? So we call that, or the industry has been calling that micro billing, and it's not a brand new concept, but it is pretty relevant when we think about the serverless operating model.
You all mentioned a couple key words I want to tie into based upon a question from Rich. And Rich asked, functions can be considered a microservice? Seems like we maybe need to clarify that a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question too. So functions is a platform that we can use to build applications that may leverage microservices. So when we talk about microservices, what we really mean are some very discrete, when we boil our application down to its nuts and bolts, there's bunches of, there's typically going to be lots of discrete pieces of logic that have to execute. And one of those pieces of some of that might just be, a RESTful call against an API that, takes an input and spits out an output. That might be a very discrete piece of logic that's part of the greater, whole of our application. And we can build that, that RESTful API call with Azure Functions, with serverless. And so that itself, that little discrete piece of logic is a microservice, and Azure Functions is the platform that we built that microservice on top of.
Ah, that makes sense. Okay. Thank you. Aiden, looks like you have a question. Can you come off mute and ask, or do you want me to just read through the IM window? I'll give you a moment to come off mute.
Are you able to hear me?
Loud and clear.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. So being an IT person, or I should say like an IT pro and a non-developer, I'm very curious, as the market shifts towards containers, functions, serverless, all that good stuff, where do you see the IT pro shifting, or where would you recommend them to kind of focus, not on the sense of having to build containers, but as part of that process now, traditionally we would manage servers and patching and all that good stuff. How do you see that kind of shifting forward in the future for IT pros, if you can have any suggestions or guidance around that?
Sure, and I'll take that one. From an IT, and that's my background. I come from an operations background, coming into serverless containers and beyond. So from that perspective, what I'd suggest is keeping in mind the technology. Think about, go down the path of what kind of code, as an IT pro, what are the operations that you're doing, right? So, i.e., provisioning, patch management, reacting to resource constraints and such. The things that as an IT pro you not only worry about but perform. So, as an example, if you want, resource management, like I said a little bit earlier, if a VM goes down or a VM has resource constraints, there is a set of logic that right now, depending on how mature you are within the technology, you are either reacting to a VM going down manually, i.e., you're having to go, log into the machine or check the platform to see if it's running or not, or you can use automation, a set of automation that you have created as an organization or as an individual that you execute when something goes down to check health statuses and whatnot. Or if it's a memory or disk running low, you can add more disk to it depending on which platform you're using. So instead of doing that from a server, let's say you have a shell script or a PowerShell script that you execute whenever low disk storage, that shell script, instead of residing within a VM, you can start thinking about how we can offload that shell script or PowerShell script into functions. So every time there is an event that you react to manually or through automation that resides on a VM, think about it how we can migrate that into functions so that you do not have to worry about the scalability and availability of that shell script or PowerShell script residing in your VM. And then as an IT pro, continue to migrate those kind of operations from your on-prem environment or within a server into functions, the more scalable the solution will be. And you can interact with functions. You can put an API through an API gateway. You can make your function endpoint be accessible from outside Azure as well. So if you have ServiceNow or Dynamics or any other CRM systems that you want to have the customer also initiate, let's say a customer wants to bring up a new dev environment, and so what you can do is all the shell scripts or all the PowerShell scripts or Python scripts or any other JavaScripts that you have written to bring up in a dev environment, you can put that code inside of functions and then have the front end make that API call directly.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Ali, one of the things we see quite a bit, as the IT, landscape evolves and moves forward, is the concept of application modernization. Taking apps that were, written, maybe years ago, but are legacy, apps that aren't really going to go away, but maybe need, to be maintained and updated. And serverless is often a big part of that modernization effort for these legacy, kind of, I call them before monolithic applications. Over time, those evolve and change. And when you think about those kind of apps, serverless might work for some subsystems within these large enterprise class applications. But at the same time, we kind of hinted at this earlier, there's going to be some pieces that just aren't going to work in a serverless world, things that have to have tight integration with on-prem components, or back-end databases that aren't going to be moving to the cloud for whatever reason. So when we think about app modernization, serverless is definitely a big part of that, but at the same time, that doesn't mean it's going to completely displace some of the more legacy technologies with IaaS or on-prem. So there's definitely still a place for the IT pro to operate. I think it's a big place for the IT pro to operate in that space. And just, like Ali mentioned, if you just go look at, the supported languages for Azure Functions, you'll see things like Power. These are experimental right now, but over time, I expect those will evolve out. But things like PowerShell, Bash, Batch, PHP. So if you're doing scripting, things that we might not call necessarily hardcore development, but as IT pros we write scripts and things all the time, you can execute those same kinds of scripts. Like maybe you have a timer job that's just running on some Windows server. You can do that with serverless as well. So there's definitely a space for the IT pro to play in the serverless world.
So it sounds like a one-size-fits-most, not a one-size-fits-all type of solution. So you need to understand where it works, what the use cases are, because it's not replacing infrastructure as a service or anything like that. Okay, that's good. So we're using the term serverless as a generic statement. Does Microsoft have, I'll call it, an official name of their serverless solution versus what AWS has with Lambda? And I'm going to have a reference here at any point to Revenge of the Nerds coming with Lambda, Lambda, Lambda. So it's out of the way. I said it, but do we have a name for this and compare it to how AWS does serverless computing?
Ours, for like a lot of other services within Azure, they are called what they do. So a storage account is a storage account. A blob storage is called blob storage. And as such, same thing goes for for serverless. It's called Azure Functions. That's what it's called.
Gotcha. Yeah, it doesn't sound like Microsoft hired a big marketing team when it came to Azure.
That's right. Now, when serverless, there are other implementations as well. Like if you go by the essence of what the terminology is serverless. But functions is one form of a service that you can use. It's the closest one that will compare to AWS in terms of the implementation. But there is app service, there is ACI, there are other methods through which you can deploy your code. And not have to worry about the underneath VMs. But for the sake of discussion that we are having today, we were going to target functions as a service. So I just wanted to highlight there are other options as well within the platform. Okay.
So anything you can tell me specifically about what AWS does or doesn't compared to Microsoft serverless implementation?
There's a lot changing there as well. So, there are a few things I could have said before reInvent that are not true now, i.e. the memory. There were memory constraints on Lambda and runtime constraints that they have just doubled as well in response to Azure platform. So, in terms of SKUs, I don't think that is that's going to be static. So as both AWS and Azure evolve, just think of it from the perspective of the backend technology where your code is executing, regardless of which platform it is. It's going to keep iterating. So from that perspective, don't think that if one platform has a limitation, it's going to have that limitation forever. Think of it from a high level architecture and process from within the application or even from an IT pro's perspective, how can you utilize serverless technology to cut down on not only the cost, the bottom line cost of running VMs, but from an operational perspective, the operational cost of maintaining and running an IT operations team or the dev team.
So what I'm hearing is it just that, the pace of innovation within the cloud. It seems like with either Azure or AWS, if there's a perceived functionality gap, don't bet that it's going to be around long for or any length of time, because things can change very quickly on the fly. So
yeah. And I'll give you an example.
Okay.
In Lambda had 50 megabytes and 5 minutes of runtime. Well, they just doubled on both. So and again, that's in response to what Microsoft Azure had in terms of the metrics around the Microsoft Functions service.
And next week we'll probably double that, and the week after that they'll double that till it's everybody.
Yeah, that's kind of the race, right? I mean, there's always going to be some small differences here and there, but over time, parity is basically achieved. And that's my view of how this will evolve. It's a race, and we'll continue to parity.
I'll just add one last thing. It's a race from a service parity perspective as well as price, right? So if both are competing, and it's not just AWS, there's the other platform as well. We are, all three of us are just competing on price as well as service functionality.
Okay, good to know. Dan, you have a question in the IM window. If you have a chance to come off mute and ask your question, that'll be great. If not, I don't mind reading it, so I'll give you a moment there.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I've played a little bit with functions, really in isolated scenarios. To be specific, I've got a little sort of the version of a console app, you could consider it, that basically just calls our timekeeping system, does some reporting and aggregation of detail, and then spits out some JSON data. And the trouble that I went through to go through OAuth authentication and things like that for that one function just made me wonder about using it in a microservices format. Do you need to kind of bake in the overhead for that authentication call for every single function, or is there some better way to do that?
Unfortunately, right now we do not have that mechanism, the RBAC mechanism that you can have your code assumed so that you don't have to worry about the authentication piece, both from authentication, and I'm assuming you're talking about authentication into other Azure resources, right? The other from within your functions, your code is trying to interact with another Azure resource.
Could be Azure. It could be something else. My particular example was for a completely separate SaaS application that's vendor provided, and I was making calls with a completely different set of authentication and credential requirements. But I see what you're saying. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, if you are in that scenario, there's really nothing that Azure, like the functions, would do, right? It's not. I don't know what the other SaaS solution was that you were trying to interact with, but from an implementation perspective, there's nothing that Azure can retain that set of credentials. You could storage in Key Vault and fetch it from there, but then you would have to worry about how do you authenticate against the Key Vault and fetch the information and then use that in code to further use it for whatever the SaaS functionality is. So from that perspective, that doesn't change in functions as it would in any other environment.
Okay, I guess the one potential scenario that I saw that might work was something like I saw a little while ago. There was a persistent functions preview or release or something like that, and I thought, well, maybe if I had like an authentication function that manages that activity for me and then is subsequently called by my other functions, maybe you could do some kind of a tiered system that way, like lock and key kind of thing. But it sounds like maybe that's not the right approach. Just bake in the authentication to every function call is kind of what you're saying.
That's right, and because the serverless technology, in at least as it is, being utilized by industry now is not having persistent data within the function, right? So basically you are reacting to external events. And on the front end, you can utilize some sort of, like you mentioned already, right? You can create a function or another set of logic that is implemented, which is backed by a persistent volume of some sort. That will retain your credentials and push your credentials on an as needed basis, as opposed to pushing those credentials inside of a function and then to iterate over the function logic every time you make a change to the credentials.
Fair enough. Thanks for your answer.
Dan, thank you for that question. Since we're talking a lot about Azure Functions, what languages does Azure Functions support?
That's a good question. So C# and JavaScript and Java and F# if you use that are supported in GA. There's also some experimental languages supported: Python, PHP, Bash, PowerShell. Those are experimental for right now, but you can certainly get around in and play around with those. So we actually had there's two Azure Functions runtimes that are out there. There's the 1.0 runtime, and then there's the 2.0, which is in preview right now. So, they don't tell me anything official, but I would expect over time that we continue to add, support for additional languages and things like that. But for right now, it's C#, JavaScript, F#, and Java.
Okay. So,
go
ahead, Ollie.
Sorry. Yeah, Jeff, let me just add to that. Like I'm a heavy Python developer, so I use functions for Python. And from a support perspective, like I am able to do everything I need to in functions through Python. Now, whether there isn't, because it's in preview, there isn't support for it, but from a functionality perspective, just don't think that if it's in preview means it doesn't work. So I would suggest, like, if it is something that you work on and it's in preview, go try it out, and likely it will work.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, that's good advice. So besides these languages, how would I use Azure Functions to leverage other Azure services? What other Azure services could I leverage? What can I do here?
Yeah, I'm gonna take your question. I'm gonna take a step back with it. Just thinking again about serverless. So when we think about serverless, it's not really just Azure Functions. That's the only serverless offering we have in Azure. If you think about services like Logic Apps, if you guys are familiar with Logic Apps is a way to kind of build and piece together, a set of functionality that connects maybe different endpoints, different, common tasks together to kind of build out kind of a basic application with a configuration first mentality. And so you can actually, if you have an existing Logic Apps that's doing something for you, but maybe it isn't quite complete because whatever you're trying to do isn't supported by the framework you get with Logic Apps, then you could pull in Azure Functions and connect a custom Azure function. Remember, Azure Functions is code you write, so the sky's the limit in terms of what you actually code. You can connect an Azure function to an existing Azure Logic app and extend the functionality of your overall solution beyond what you would be able to do with just Logic Apps itself. So thinking about serverless, as a whole, it's really more than just Azure Functions, and there's different approaches to essentially achieving the same end result of executing code on an infrastructure backend that you don't have to manage, and that's totally obfuscated. So we have Azure Functions, we have Azure Logic Apps, we have other things that I think could be considered similar to or part of the serverless landscape that like Flow, for example, is another app that we have it's kind of configuration first in terms of, let me just connect the dots in kind of a GUI or less of a development mentality, just as a builder mentality. Those are also a form of serverless in a way, and so those can all integrate with Azure Functions as well. So there's a lot of potential when you think about Azure Functions, since that's the most customizable, that's the most developer-like, but there's all these other apps and things that we support as well that have that serverless mechanic behind the scenes.
So it sounds
Yeah,
very robust,
and
lots of options.
yeah, and the other option that I, as just as a use case, I was going to highlight is application insights, right? So if you have a set of logic that you're executing and you want to pipe in your logic metrics into some sort of technology, then Azure Application Insights is another one. You can utilize API. Application Insights has API that you can utilize to that you can integrate into your logic that is being deployed in functions, and as such, you basically have you're accounting for monitoring within an application that you don't really have deployed on a server. So that's another good example of how other Azure services would integrate into functions. Now, it doesn't, like, if you have some other mechanism that you use for monitoring, like AppDynamics or New Relic or any of the other ones, you can utilize their API inside of functions as well, and basically seemingly have your application specific information feed into that mechanism as well.
So now that I've got a better idea of what serverless is and does, and it seems it's rather robust, I think, Dale, you had a quote from Mark Russinovich in your blog, which made me want to ask, why is serverless so hot all of a sudden? Why did this just seemingly come out of the blue? Or have I just been under a rock? Why is it so hot? And why did Mark say what he said in your blog?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, Jeff. When I think about just not only serverless, but just if you've been around IT for a while, and I know, the three of us certainly have, and I'm certainly the folks on the call as well, it's just a constant evolution of abstractions, right? When we go all the way back to the beginning of, measuring high and low voltages on a circuit board, that turned into ones and zeros, which turns into machine code, which turns into, now we have, these advanced languages like C# and all these other things, all these abstractions, right? And so serverless is really another set of, from the infrastructure side, it's another set of abstractions. So we had servers, we had virtualization, then we had containerization, and now we've abstracted all of that away from the, from the front of our mind in terms of designing and building applications. And so this is just another step in that evolutionary journey, not to get all philosophical about it all, but to me, that's the way that I think about it. And it becomes another option that we have when we build applications. And so this was always coming, because that's just the forward march of the evolution of technology. That additional layers of abstraction, so we don't have to think as much about all the plumbing and the back end, and we can focus really on what's important, building a good solution that meets the requirements of the solution, not worrying about all the complex things that go along with the cloud first world. In particular, scale. Scale is pretty hard to do. When going from 1 to 10 is easy, going from 10 to a million is more difficult in terms of users and just this, the scale of our applications. So to me, what Mark was getting at there is that this is the next step. We want to make that platform option available and be very robust, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that this is the only way, or this is the only way to do things. This is just the next evolution in how we can build robust, scalable cloud applications.
And I just add to everything that Dale, plus one on everything that Dale just said, but also, up until very recently, it didn't work. And there weren't a lot of organizations that had the scale that some of these cloud providers have, including Azure.
That's a great point. So. Yeah.
So just as TCP/IP evolved, so when DHCP came out, the guy who used to walk around the office with the spreadsheet and maintain the list of all the static IPs, he didn't need his job anymore. What does this replace? Does it replace anything? Does it make something we've been doing in IT obsolete? How would you position this?
I would say, at least in the short term, and even looking into a little bit of I would even argue long term, this supplements IaaS. It is by no means, and it depends, and so I'll just state it. It supplements IaaS. There are workloads that you would not want to deploy on functions. If you have a monolithic application, can you take out code, all of that code, and push it into functions, or try to jam it in there? Yes, you can. Is that a good use case? Probably not. But actually, definitely not. So there are still limitations on serverless technology.
Right.
The execution runtime is another one. If you have a query that runs for 5 hours, then that's probably not a good use case of why you would want to utilize serverless technology. And the third that comes to mind is having stateful logic be deployed in serverless technology. I think that was one of the questions earlier as well. Can you do it? Yes, you can. Is that something that you should? Probably not. Not now and not ever and maybe not never because of the how fast technology is evolving. And I'm sure Azure is Microsoft and AWS and other platforms are also iterating over the serverless technology. So maybe there might come a time where they will have unlimited execution time, unlimited memory, and have persistent volumes incorporated within the serverless technology. That might happen in the future, but as of right now, and thinking of how you would want to utilize serverless technology, those are the kind of workloads that probably should not go on there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we've got C# today, but we, still use C to write, some applications that just it's a better fit for. So it's definitely not, the end all be all for development.
Okay. Chris, you have a long question in the IM window. Do you have a chance to come off mute and ask your question aloud, or do you want me to read it as part of this session here?
Sure, happy to speak to it, and apologies for the length. It was just kind of a rambling thought, I suppose, but it was just, moving aside from the deep technical aspect, just the thoughts from the group as to any nuance or any change that might occur in how, as an organization full of developers or otherwise, does this change the way that you have to work with that public cloud provider? Because you're essentially giving up that much more of the control of the stack to the public cloud provider. Therefore, is it more imperative to have that direct, in Microsoft parlance, it would probably be Premier, but some sort of direct support relationship with that public cloud provider in a way that they really haven't had to focus on in the past, because now so much of that control has been ceded to the provider. And if that means now from a partner perspective, or even from a direct organizational perspective, that needs to be rethought as far as how to get support and to manage that effectively.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that one. We are talking about serverless and specific Microsoft functions, but like I mentioned earlier, Microsoft functions, Azure functions is not the only way to implement serverless, right? There are other venues through which you can, and if you want kind of independence and control over your logic being executed in any platform, the one that comes to mind for me right now is OpenFaaS. It's a serverless implementation on Kubernetes. So as long as you have a Kubernetes cluster, you can create functions through OpenFaaS framework or serverless functions or Lambda functions and have them be around the framework of OpenFaaS. And as such, you should be able to migrate them onto on-prem, AWS, GCP, or Azure, and not worry about the tie-in that you would have if you were developing specifically for Microsoft functions or Lambda or any other technology.
And Chris, to address the question around the relationship that you have with with Microsoft in this case, or the provider, right? I don't think that this signals some kind of momentum shift in how that relationship should be handled. Certainly, we want and encourage a strong, positive relationship with all of our partners, and that's something that I know Ali and Jeff and I strive for every day. But from a technology perspective, I wouldn't think of Azure Functions to be specific as being significantly different from a vendor a partner to vendor relationship perspective, from support, or really from any other angle, to be any different from things like Azure SQL Database or any of the other Azure platform services where you don't have direct control over the infrastructure, but we still publish SLAs, we still offer support around those products and services with the same exact level of or what am I trying to say here? With the same through the same mechanisms that we offer for the other platform services and really all of our products that we make available. So certainly I think it's important to have a strong and positive relationship. That we grow and evolve together, but the specific technology here, or even the serverless, taking a step back, the serverless paradigm in general, I don't think changes the relationship that we want to have with our partners.
And Chris, question: is there a specific level of control that you're looking for, or where there might be some concern about I don't control X, Y, and Z anymore? Can you maybe elaborate on that a bit?
I think what it's partially from my perspective as a Microsoft partner is addressing and getting ahead of some of the questions that inevitably come from organizations as you move closer with them and they're starting to open up and become more comfortable moving to in this direction. It's just this anxiety that comes up around ceding that control in general, which we've all experienced is just part of the cloud momentum anyway. But as you get higher up the stack and you move towards SaaS, there's kind of this additional level of anxiety that we note, and not just related to the public cloud provider kind of support mechanism, but also as it pertains to compatibility across different public cloud providers. So you look at functions, right? An inevitable question that a customer will give us is, okay, well, what if we start using Lambda in addition to functions? Is that going to create any sort of weird incompatibility issues that we can't develop freely anymore? We're kind of choosing our path, and we have to stick with it now for years to come because we made that decision at that one moment in time. So anyway, these answers definitely help to flesh that out a little bit better and get ahead of some of those questions. So it's definitely appreciated.
Great. I think you raised a good question I'd like Ali and Dale to address is, what if I have a cross-platform implementation here? Would you perceive any issues in doing that? What should I be concerned about, or is that just a non-issue?
So if you have an application that you want to or if you have an existing application or want to develop a new application that you want to utilize serverless technologies on, you kind of need to determine what is the platform it's going to be deployed on. And if the end target is to achieve serverless implementation, then choose a cloud provider you're comfortable with, have better relationship with, and trust, and utilize their platform to deploy your application on. But if the chief target here is to the target is to be agnostic from an implementation perspective, regardless of which platform you're on or which cloud provider you're on, then go with an implementation, an open source implementation, like I discussed a little bit earlier, was OpenFast, right? OpenFast gets implemented on a Kubernetes cluster. It doesn't need to be Kubernetes. You can do Docker Swarm. There are other implementations that OpenFast is an open source project that you can run on that it can run on. And once you decide that, okay, OpenFast is the framework that we're going to develop against, well, OpenFast will be implementable on any computing environment, whether it's on-prem, whether it's any other cloud provider's platform. So, but at the end of the day, you still need to determine what it is, or there is the other option of coming up with your own serverless mechanism, and that's probably not as easy depending on the size of the organization or the will of the organization, but it's still there needs to be a framework that you develop your application against.
Yeah, and just for a little additional tidbit there, one thing that I think is really neat, Microsoft's really embraced open source quite a bit over the last several years, and that momentum continues to build. And just fun fact, Azure Functions, the runtime is all open source. It's on GitHub. That's published on our the docs page for Azure Functions. So there's nothing you can go and look at what's going on under the hood yourself if you want, and I think that's pretty neat, and two, it's just kind of shows the spirit of open source that we're embracing, and I think it's particularly relevant in the world of serverless, where these kinds of questions. It's a great question, by the way, Chris, where those kind of questions are top of mind for our partners and customers.
Great, Chris, thank you. Appreciate that line of dialogue. That was very good. Checking the clock here, we're almost at the top of the hour, so we've got time for one last question. Anyone have anything they want to bring up for discussion before we adjourn today's call? All right, sounds like we've got a good, strong, captivated audience. So, Ali and Dale, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I appreciate you making the investment into the community here, discussing all things around serverless. We had a great turnout today. Thank you, everyone, for being here to the end, being very engaged, and we've got some cool topics coming up. Next month, we're going to be talking about Citrix on Azure. So in the meantime, happy holidays, everyone. Merry Christmas. Thank you for being here. We'll catch you in January, and you all take care. And thanks one last time.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.